The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, happy St. Valentine's Day to you all. Another episode of Genesis is coming up, and as always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and we are bringing another guest back. And you know I like when guests come back. That means I'm doing something right, unlike what my wife tells me. But anyway, we got J.D. Thorne. We're going to be talking more about his wonderful book, The Ten Commandments of Baseball. And although the book is not a very long book, it's a very easy read. It's part memoir, part fact. It's about 170 pages. Talk about this book forever. And that's the good thing about it, because every logic, every commandment that McCarthy has in his sayings is relevant to baseball today and to life in general. And if you read the reviews, if you go on Google and you read the reviews, you got the Wisconsin Bar commenting this. You have a couple of reviews commenting on this, and they all say Joe McCarthy's Ten Commandments of Baseball can be applied to every facet of life. And some of them may seem like common sense, and some may cry that it's outdated, but I'm going to tell you, it's not. Maybe I'm an old chestnut. Hey, maybe I'm just a scholar that likes philosophy. But I think it's important enough to bring J.D. back and talk more about his fantastic book. And we're going to do that in about 2 minutes, because we're going to pause the station identification. Of course, you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho. Let me tell you something, folks. Ralph's getting a lot of love out there with his podcast and these networks. You know, for me, I'm just happy to be associated with him and a bunch of other great authors like Peter Golubach, Halbach. We got Bill Kashadis out in Philadelphia. We got ex-ball player, Mark Littell has his own show. We got the niece of Charlie Finley. We got Nancy Finley talking Oakland A's baseball out there. How much more do you want? Charlie O, the mule, and the green, gold, and white, those white shoes. I mean, who could forget those swinging A's? We got a lot of good shows, and I'm just happy that my show Genesis found a home on the network. And believe me, every time I do a show, every time that somebody wants to be on my show and looks forward to talk to me, just like today, which is St. Valentine's Day, I feel the love, and I try to give the love. And now I'm turning to J.D. We'll give a little bit biography about him. Hey, he's a lawyer like me. God bless him. All these people. All these people. I think he's in labor law, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, hey, he's a professional speaker. He wrote a couple of books, including this one. He's loved baseball ever since he was a kid, went to University of Wisconsin. That guy just loves Wisconsin. As I mentioned last time, hey, we got Alan Bud Selig. He commented on the book right here. I got to get a hold of Bud. My collusion book is really heating up. I'm not even past collusion 1 through all this time. And his name pops up everywhere because he was the director of the Players Committee for the owners. And it's just an amazing thing. Bud did a lot of good for the finances of the game, but there have been a lot of things in his history which I'll have another show on it, which to me strikes me why he's in the Hall of Fame, along with Bowie Kuhn, and why Marvin Miller isn't there, because he changed the landscape of the game. But that's another show for another time. But I just want to welcome back J.D. to the show. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you, Ian.
Oh, now let me ask you something. We went through some things. We scratched the surface last time. We know McCarthy had the most success with the Yankees. But let me ask you this. We know he drank he was drinking more heavily when he was with the Red Sox. And he had early success with the Cubs, and I know he groomed himself in St. Louis. Do you think that his philosophy remained with him all through those years?
Well, I think there's little doubt about it. He fashioned these 10 Commandments of Baseball when he was a minor league manager Now, that would have been in 1921 when he managed the Louisville Colonels, which was the top AAA affiliate of the Chicago Cubs at the time. And he was manager there from about 1919 to 1925 when the Cubs brought him up. The genesis of my book really started when I found an advertising card from an Iowa restaurant that my father had visited in 1975 and kept in his top dresser drawer of his bedroom chest of drawers until he passed away in 2003. So I knew that this had to mean something to him. Now, the card itself, the owner of this Iowa, it was called the Dugout Restaurant, had pitched for the New York Yankees when McCarthy was manager there. And then he put this advertising card out for any customers that wanted to take it. And it said, printed in the best interests of baseball. And on one side was the proprietor's photograph in his New York Yankee uniform. Now, he was a pitcher for the Yankees in the mid-40s, not of any great stature or renown, but he still was pitching for the New York Yankees in the 1940s. So that's always a good show. The idea is that I'm fairly certain that these 10 Commandments of baseball were used by McCarthy all the way through his career if it was still being used by him in the 1940s. His style of management, though, was he spent more time with the younger players to instill in them the kinds of philosophies that he knew would make them a good professional baseball player. The veterans, like when he managed the Boston Red Sox, Ted Williams, we talked a little bit about that last month. He kind of let them alone and do their own thing because they were already established players. He didn't have to coach them, and they knew what to do to be ready for each and every game and each and every pitch. The younger players, as they came up, they were instilled with his philosophy of the 10 Commandments of baseball. And so it was very important, at least important to this restaurant proprietor who had pitched for the Yankees in the 40s to print these rules.
And you know something? I want to mention all three of these guys. I want to mention Ruth and Gehrig and Ted Williams because we're talking about icons here. Now, somebody once asked him, and you wrote it in your book, they said, hey, listen, Joe, now that they brought down the right field fence, do you think if Ted Williams played in New York, he would have broke Babe Ruth's record? And he responded, hey, Lou Gehrig didn't. What's your thing on him and Ruth? Ruth had a very tumultuous relationship with the Miller Huggins. How was he with Joe McCarthy?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I did not come across anything that Babe Ruth had any problem with McCarthy. And I think that's probably because McCarthy, knowing him to be a veteran player, left him alone. Of course, Ruth was his own entity anyway. I mean, he had his own car on the Yankees train. He was the highest paid player in baseball. He was the most famous. He was among those icons of the 1920s, which might, you think of Jack Dempsey in boxing and maybe the Four Horsemen playing for Notre Dame in football. Babe Ruth was number one. Even the Japanese soldiers during World War II, because Ruth had done barnstorming, which included Japan, and they loved him in Japan. So the Japanese soldiers were trained to throw the worst epithet that they could think of at the American troops, and that was to say, "To hell with your Babe Ruth."
Yeah.
And I don't think it worked too well, but that was the esteem he was held in worldwide. So I don't think McCarthy had to do too much with Babe, but the relationship between the two of them was, of course, that I shouldn't say of course, but after after Miller Huggins passed away, so tragically and so young, and he had been a great manager of the Yankees in the 20s. The Yankees were looking for another manager. First, they tapped, I think, an assistant coach, Art Fowler, I think was his name, and he didn't really want the job and said no. But then they said, well, we have to have somebody coach the team. Would you do that on an interim basis? Although he was not announced as an interim coach, but that was the agreement while the Yankees looked for someone else. The time period went into 1929, 1930. Well, Babe Ruth wanted to be the Yankee manager. He put his oar in the water for the job. But if the Yankee management were terrified of Babe Ruth running the ball club. They said he can't even manage himself, let alone manage 25 other players. It'll just be chaos. And they probably were right about that. So they were searching for just the right manager. And then in 1930, Joe McCarthy had run out his string with the Chicago Cubs. Rogers Hornsby had come to the team in 1929. And McCarthy had built the Cub teams they were last place in 1925. And it was so bad that the manager quit on the team during the June of the season. He was so disgusted with the players and their lack of discipline, and so much so that the Cubs hired a veteran that they had acquired from the Pittsburgh Pirates, Rabbit Moranville, who was really a prankster. And you mentioned about McCarthy having maybe a drinking problem later on in his career. They said that he liked Dewar's Scotch. But I don't think that was as much of a problem with McCarthy. But it certainly was a problem with Babe Ruth, and it certainly was a problem with many of the players, including Rabbit Moranville, almost leading the league in problems with his drinking. So much so that I put in the book a great quote that I came across from Rabbit Moranville himself, and we put it in the chapter under commandment number 10. A pitcher without control hasn't anything, meaning self-control. And Rabbit Moranville said, well, there's in 1927, he said, there's a lot less drinking in baseball than there used to be. And he said, that's because I quit drinking. He was released by the Cubs, and Branch Rickey of the Cardinals, as one quote I saw, always looking for a deal on the cheap. He picked up Moranville and who became a Hall of Fame infielder, mostly for his fielding records and longevity. But in 1927, Branch Rickey put him in the minor leagues with said, no, you're going to have to stop drinking. And if you do, if you can't hold to that, the moment that I become aware of it, you're going to be fired. And Moranville got the message. So he quit drinking totally and was able to sustain that. Well, sure enough, in the 1927 season and for actually another 5 seasons in the big leagues, he played a terrific shortstop, second base, filled in, and proved Branch Rickey right on taking a chance on him. So much so that the Veterans Committee voted Moranville in because of his great fielding records, his great longevity. He was always a good player in the team. I think of Moranville, too. I go back to one of the greatest undertold stories in baseball was the comeback engineered by the Boston Braves in 1914 when they were in, and Moranville was starting second base or starting shortstop. They had picked up from the Cubs Johnny Evers, who played second base and was then a pretty grizzled veteran. The team was in last place on the 4th of July. Now, it was an 18 league. Last place, they, maybe weren't totally buried in the standings, but they still were last place. And then they played an exhibition game on the 4th of July against their minor league team and beat. The major league team gets beat. Well, there's a story that I think Johnny Evers and probably Whit Moranville, they had a team meeting. Now, I would love to have been a fly on the wall to hear what they talked about. But they came out of that team meeting in such a fury and a determination that they went all the way from last place to first place, and they won the pennant going away. They won the pennant by 8 games. They could not be stopped, and then went into the World Series against Connie Mack's Philadelphia A's, who had what was called the $1 million infield at the time, featuring Home Run Baker and a few other really genuine stars. And the A's were vastly favored to beat these upstart Braves, who were in last place on the 4th of July and managed to put the whole season together. And sure enough, the Braves rolled over them in 4 games. They were hot, and Moranville was a part of that. So, at any rate, Branch Rickey made a nice thing, and but to kind of circle back now to being a manager, Moranville didn't last for with the Cubs. He didn't even finish out the season when he got the managing job in 1925, and he didn't even ask for it. The Cub management, featuring William Veeck, Bill Veeck's father, who was an innovator and who's the guy that eventually decided to convince Phil Wrigley to bring up their minor league manager, even though he hadn't himself played a day of Major League Baseball, being Joe McCarthy, to try his hand at managing the Chicago Cubs. But it was a disastrous situation that McCarthy walked into, and he, little by little, piece by piece, following his 10 Commandments of baseball rules, put that team together. Now, I think one of the things that William Veeck Sr. Got lucky about in hiring McCarthy was that in those days, scouting wasn't what it is today. But McCarthy, he knew all the players in the minor leagues, all the young talent coming up. And he knew who he wanted and who he didn't want. Sometimes that's more important. Of the players who would emulate his style of baseball, which was inside baseball. His outfielders always threw to the right base. His base runners never got thrown out trying to take an extra base. The infielders played back at the right times to get double plays, and they got them. Which is always a pitcher's greatest friend. The little things that make the difference in winning baseball. So McCarthy was able to use these rules when he got to the major leagues, although he had a little fight there too, because when he came in, so it's 1926, the players, there were several veteran players that Moranville was gone by then, but they didn't really cotton to a young guy like McCarthy trying to tell him what to do, who had never played in the major leagues himself. He said, "What do you know about baseball? You never played in this league." And the chief culprit in that regard was a Hall of Fame Grover Cleveland Alexander, who was then the Cubs had picked up for some veteran pitching, and he was still pitching effectively in the major leagues. But he had a fight with McCarthy in the clubhouse early in the season, over this very issue of authority. And McCarthy knew that if he lost that battle and he lost the respect of the players, he wouldn't last too long. So it was an important battle for McCarthy. There's a terrifically funny story that's Bill Veeck writes about, because he's about 12 years old at the time and hanging around the clubhouse. And after the fight between Grover Cleveland Alexander and McCarthy, I shouldn't say fight, argument, Grover Cleveland said to Bill Veeck, he said, "Oh, come on, kid. Come on with me. Let's go have some fun." Now, you talk about drinking in baseball, and I have to say that was probably a occupational hazard at the time. If you think about it, the men playing the game, you weren't, some of them sixth grade education, eighth grade education, if that, coming off the farms. They were a tough, rough sort of men that were engaged in this. Well, what do? You play a game. There were no lights. So when were the games played? During the afternoon. Well, what did you do at night? You're all jacked up from playing a game of baseball. You're tired from putting forth your best effort. What do? You go out and have a couple of beers and celebrate, especially if you won. I think of a great quote from a Boston player, Johnny Pesky. He said, "Gee, when you win and you come home, your wife looks like Gina Lola Brigida. But if you lose, oh no, it's terrible." So so McCarthy had a way of dealing with the players, and particularly with his way of dealing with the veterans reminded me of what in football they say Vince Lombardi did when Jim Ringo in 1960, who was his all-pro center on the offensive line, came in and he said, "Coach," for his negotiations on his player contract the next year, and he said, "Coach, you mind? I brought in a fella who's going to sit with me while I talk with you, and he's serving as my agent." Well, that had never happened before. And Lombardi is alleged to have said to him, "Oh, Jim, sit down. Nice to meet you, young man. And I've got a phone call I've got to make, and I'll be right back." Well, he didn't. He made a phone call, and he made it to another team, and he immediately traded Jim Ringo to the Philadelphia Eagles, I think. And then he came back in the room and said, "Oh, Jim, by the way, you're talking to the wrong guy here. You no longer are a Green Bay Packer." So there were those ways of handling it. When McCarthy did with Grover Cleveland and Alexander, he immediately traded him to Brad Fricke and the St. Louis Cardinals. Now, the ironic part about that's 1926, the Cardinals went on to win the pennant, and Grover Cleveland Alexander was their number one pitcher, so much so that in the seventh game of the World Series, he had already pitched the sixth game, a complete game, and so it's the very next day, and they got into about the sixth inning, and the coach, who was Rogers Hornsby, said to Alexander, "Do you think you can go out and stop him?" And so he pitched another 3 innings on no day's rest, and I think he struck out Tony Lazzari with the bases loaded and 2 outs to end the inning, and then went on and pitched the 8th and 9th innings shutout, and by golly, he did it and was such a hero that they even made a Hollywood movie about him and overcoming his drinking problem with the starring one of those beautiful Hollywood actresses, and she so it was called The Winning Team, and it was really his wife. They made the story up to be about his wife and himself, and of course, playing Grover Cleveland Alexander was Ronald Reagan. So usually around this time we start seeing the baseball movies when you get a chance. Look for The Winning Team. So that's what happened after McCarthy had the row with him. He traded him right away. So the funny story, though, I think that Bill Veeck writes is immediately after this argument, Bill Veeck goes with Grover Cleveland Alexander. They stop at a few bars, and he has a few beers, and Veeck is only 12 years old. But then he said that Cleveland said to Veeck, he said, "Well, let's go have some fun at Riverview Park." And maybe I told this story before, but Riverview Park is sort of like Coney Island in Chicago. At least it was in those times, and it was actually only about a mile west of on Addison, which the Wrigley Field is on. And so the two guys, the young kid and Grover Alexander, go to Riverview Park. Well, the roller coasters are going swoosh and this way and that way, and I remember going there as a kid myself. It closed in about 1975, but we had a lot of fun there. That was a magic thing to do, especially if you were a kid. And then you walk through on the tarmac, and on one side you'll see the painted the painted lady or the bearded lady and the snake charmer and come in, and it was always spooky as heck. And then if you walked a little further on the tarmac, it turned and was right on near the Chicago River, and which was why it was called Riverview Park. There was a baseball exhibit, and so you would throw baseballs at a target, and what would happen is that there were two cages with platforms on them, and and then people would sit on those platforms, and below them would be a tank of water. So if you hit the target, then that would activate the mechanism on the platform that would release the platform, and the guys would get dunked in the water. So everybody would laugh, and that's the way that would go. And it cost 10 cents a ball, and if you hit the target, which was not easy to do, then the next ball was free. So how would you think about it? And this is where I think this would be a great scene for a movie, Ian. If you think about it, how did the people in the cages, and this was always a job for a black man, and they'd wear overalls, and every now and again they'd get dunked, and that would be the way it would go. But how would they get a share of the profits? And it was something to do, a way to gain your livelihood. But how would they get people to throw it?
That's a good.
Very often it was. And I remember this when I was a kid. So you're walking by, and then they would taunt the people walking by. Oh, come on, you can't hit the broadside of a barn door. Who are you? But they would see this as a role for Chris Rock and maybe one of the other black actors, comedians. They would be the two black men sitting in the cages, and you've got somebody playing a 12-year-old and somebody playing Grover Cleveland Alexander, but they must have said something that got under his skin. Now, mind you, he's just had a blow up with his manager. He's just had a few drinks, and he's also got the kid with him, and he wants to show off to the kid. Well, they must have said, "Oh, you cracker, you can't do anything." Whatever they must have hurled some insult at him. So he stops and he goes, "Oh, you want to play this game? Okay." Now, little did they know that he was probably reputed as being the best control pitcher in baseball at the time. And when he paid his 10 cents and got the first baseball, well, he hit that target right in the center of it, and plop, the guy goes into the water. Well, then he gets the second ball is free, and there were two cages, and you were really supposed to throw at the one right in front of you, but there was nobody else there, I guess, and he threw across, and he hit the other target, and then the other guy goes down, swoosh, into the water. Well, just as the first guy is getting back on his platform, he gets another ball. If you hit the target, the balls are free, and boom, he hits the target again. Bill Beck wrote that went on for about 15 minutes, and he drowned both guys. And I see this in slow motion with these guys going into the tank, and I just think it's one of these things that makes baseball human. So at any rate, he got back to the dugout, and the next day he was traded to the Cardinals, and his life went on. In fact, even prospered. He's in the World Series and was the World Series hero. All because of McCarthy, really, in the sense that McCarthy was trying to tell him what to do, and he didn't like it.
And it's funny because in 1932, you got McCarthy's two philosophies coming together in the World Series. He built up the Cubs bolt by bolt, and now he has a juggernaut Yankee team that is now first digesting his type of brand of baseball. How did the McCarthy philosophy work in that 1932 World Series?
Well, it took 2 years. Now, McCarthy was first hired in 31. In 1930, with the Cubs, what had happened was, I personally think that when William Wrigley opened up the pocketbook and traded in 1929, they wanted to win that pennant in the worst way, and so he traded for Rogers Hornsby, who was then with Boston. And I think it was written he gave up an arm and a leg to get Hornsby because they thought that was the one piece that they really needed. And of course it was. The Cubs went on to win the pennant in '29. But I have a small hunch that part of that deal in signing Hornsby was that they promised Hornsby, he had been the manager of the Cardinals in '26 as a player, that Hornsby wanted to be the Chicago Cubs manager, but of course McCarthy already had the job. So he spent a lot of time, according to some of the research, that of working to undermine McCarthy with Wrigley. Oh, he shouldn't have made this pitching change, second guessing every move. So that in 1930, the year after they won the National League pennant 29, the team finished third. In fact, part of it was because Rogers Hornsby himself injured his ankle on a slide in the third base and missed most of the season. So that hurt the team. They finished third, respectably, but after the season, Wrigley couldn't really fire McCarthy after winning the pennant, but he could fire him after not winning the pennant in 1930, and so McCarthy was gone, and he replaced him with Rogers Hornsby. Now, the story is that the Yankees were looking for a manager, and a sports writer in Chicago who followed McCarthy and could see how good a manager he was, spoke with one of his sports writer counterparts in New York and said, if the Yankees are still looking for a manager, McCarthy's available, and they might want to talk to him. And the sports writer, this is how things worked in those days, relayed that message to Yankee management, and they said, it's not a bad idea. Now, he's never managed in the American League. He's only managed in the National League. And then before that, it was he hasn't managed in the major leagues, only in the minor leagues. Well, they got through that, and McCarthy was given the job. Now, after 5 years of handling the Cubs, he knew how to manage, people, and so he becomes manager of the Yankees. Now, there was also so again, he knew that one of his challenges would be establishing his authority with the players. And it didn't mean that the players all had to like him. So, no, that's not how you got respect from the players. But they had to respect your knowledge and ability about baseball. Could this manager, by following his tenets, help me win? And if I win, then we can get that World Series check, which my wife really likes when I get it. Apparently in spring training, there was very early on, there was an incident with Tony Lazzari where McCarthy had to kind of yell at him and discipline him. But Lazzari was such a veteran that he knew he had it coming. And he said, "Coach, don't worry about me." Well, once McCarthy had Lazzari's respect, Lazzari worked, and McCarthy got the respect of all the other players. So I think his when he put in his tenets for the 10 Commandments of baseball, how to play, I think they were adopted by the players without hesitation, and they knew that he knew, and he was experienced. And so now it still took a year. 1931 was the last of the 3 years of the Philadelphia A's of Connie Mack, and some say that was the greatest team ever, not the 27 Yankees, but the 29, 30, 31 Philadelphia A's with Milwaukee and well, anyway, they had great players. I'll think of it in a second. They
had Simmons on the team.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
Al Simmons they had on the team,
right?
And they had Jimmy Fox, I think, was on the team.
Right. I think Mickey Cochran behind the plate.
He was, yeah.
And they had the pitching was fantastic. So they had a great squad. So at any rate, they won the last of their American League pennants in a row from the Yankees, who dominated the 20s. in 31, and then in 32, by golly, the Yankees rose up, and you say about relationships with players, McCarthy got very close to Lou Gehrig, and Lou Gehrig was his favorite player of all time. Of course, McCarthy himself was an East Coast guy. He grew up in Philadelphia. He played baseball in New York, in the minor leagues, Pennsylvania. He was, so being on the East Coast didn't bother McCarthy. With Gehrig, it was said that when McCarthy retired and they called him the Squire of Germantown or something, or above Squire of Buffalo. He retired to Buffalo. His wife was from Buffalo. In his mantle, he had a room full of a lot of memorabilia that he picked up over the year. But in his living room, in his parlor, where he greeted guests, there was only one player of a baseball player, only one picture of a baseball player that he had on his mantle, and that was Lou Gehrig. Of course, he was so significant, it was Lou Gehrig. It was McCarthy that when Lou Gehrig said, I'm just not playing very well, Coach, and I don't know why, and I'm having medical tests to try and figure this out. Maybe the doctors can find something. So it was May 2nd, 1937. Lou Gehrig had started at first base for the Yankees for 17 consecutive years, played over 2,000 games, goes to McCarthy. I think they were in Detroit, and there had been an incident the day before where Lou Gehrig was playing first base, and he wasn't hitting not his normal way. He had such great power, left-handed hitter. There were some sports writers who were trying to figure out what it was, but they said he'd take his big cut, he'd hit the ball as square as he could hit it, and it would be a fly out to the second baseman in short right field. The ball just wouldn't go anywhere. So he's playing first base, and a routine ground ball is hit to the shortstop. Well, Lou Gehrig found himself having to hustle his life off just to get to first base in time for the throw, which he did, and he took the throw. And as they were coming into the dugout, the shortstop quipped to Lou Gehrig. Of course, we had the tremendous respect from all the players. And he said, "Oh, nice play, Lou." And Gehrig knew in his heart that it was just an ordinary ground ball. It was not a great play. And it was that realization that, wait a minute, something's wrong here. So on May 2nd, in Detroit, Gehrig, I think before the first game of the series in Detroit in the hotel, Gehrig goes to McCarthy and says, "Coach, take me out of the lineup." And McCarthy looked at him and said, "Well, why should I do that? You've only played my first baseman for all these years. You've played 17. You're my first baseman." And Lou Gehrig apparently said to him, "Coach, for the good of the team." So that day, for the game, for the very first time, Lou Gehrig did not go out to take his position at first base. And instead, as team captain, he walked out the lineup to the umpires before the start of the game, and then walked back to the dugout and did not go on the field and never played again. He stayed with the team for a couple of weeks, and then he got the diagnosis from the physicians at the Mayo Clinic that he had an incurable nerve disease. Now we call it Lou Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And it was amazing when you think about it. It was only 10 weeks later, on the 4th of July, that after, it's like everything, the medical news was leaked to the press, and there was a tremendous pouring of sympathy and support for Lou Gehrig, and they had Lou Gehrig Day on the 4th of July in Yankee Stadium, 60,000 people there. But he was really a private man and a very shy man, actually. And he was overwhelmed. I mean, they had assembled the 1927 Yankees, of which he had played on. There were 60,000 people in the stands, and he received gifts. He received he was just overwhelmed with it. One of the gifts he received was a plaque or like a loving cup from his teammates. And they had gone to one of the sports writers and said, "Can you help us with this? What should we put on this bronze plaque?" So that, I mean, it's just a fantastic poem, about teammates. And then when Lou Gehrig was, away from the team, that loving cup was the one thing that he kept out too. And then there were reports of how he would sit in his chair and just stare at that, and remembering his teammates and how they felt. And but so you have the 4th of July. Gehrig was overwhelmed. And he had prepared a speech, but he threw the speech away, and he said, I can't do this. I can't get up and speak. But it was McCarthy who pushed him from behind and said, "Lou, you can't disappoint the crowd." And he listened to McCarthy, and he got up to speak, so it was really contemporaneously. And I put the speech in the book because, I found the whole speech. Usually all you hear is, "I'm the luckiest man," and which is tremendous in and of itself. But the whole speech, which is not that long, I think is absolutely tremendous too. So in that famous, slightly trembling voice that echoed throughout the stadium, he quietly spoke. And this is what he said. "Fans, for the past 2 weeks, you've been reading about a bad break I got. Yet today, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. I have been in ballparks for 17 years and have never received anything but kindness and encouragement from you fans." And they turned around and looked at the Yankees and said, "Look at these grand men. Which of you wouldn't consider it the highest highlight of his career just to associate with them for even one day? Sure, I'm lucky. Who wouldn't have considered it an honor to have known Jacob Rupert, who was the owner? Also the builder of baseball's greatest empire, Ed Barrow, who was the general manager. To have spent 6 years with that wonderful little fellow, Miller Huggins. And then to have spent the next 9 years with that outstanding leader, that smart student of psychology, the best manager in baseball today, Joe McCarthy. When the New York Giants, a team you would give your right arm to beat, and vice versa, sends you a gift, that's something. When everybody down to the groundskeepers and those boys in white coats, I think that would be the hot dog vendors, remember you with trophies, that's something. When you have a wonderful mother-in-law who takes sides with you in squabbles with her own daughter, now that's really something. When you have a father and mother who work all their lives so you can have an education, they put them through Columbia, and build your body, it's a blessing. When you have a wife who's been a tower of strength and shown more courage than you ever dreamed existed, why, that's the finest thing I know. That's a good one for Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
So I close in saying that I might have been given a bad break, but I've got an awful lot to live for. So a lot of that credit goes. That to me is one of the greatest utterances in the human language, considering the circumstances. And McCarthy had a lot to do with that. How did he get along with the Yankees? I think McCarthy got along just fine. And he worked with the younger players and kind of let the veterans alone. And he also had good talent, great talent, superior talent. In fact, they won 7 World Series championships under McCarthy. I think they had a streak where they won 4 to 5 years. People were saying, break up the Yankees, the dynasty. No one else will be able to win. In the late 30s, they were just unstoppable. And then entered Joe DiMaggio, starting in 1939, and his famous streak in 1941, 56 games. And he credits McCarthy, too. He said McCarthy was excellent to work for because you might think, I have a 3-0 count, DiMaggio said, but once I got into that streak, you might say, well, take the next pitch. Don't swing at it. And if it's a ball, then you walk, and that'll be a good thing. He said McCarthy would often let him swing away because very often that 3-0 pitch would be a sweet one because the pitcher wanted to get it over the plate. And generally the batters would take it. Well, sometimes that was the one good pitch he'd see during a game to help him keep his streak going. So McCarthy worked with him. It's hard to, and then it was the same way when he was managing the Boston Red Sox. Ted Williams, he made a point of, in early spring training, McCarthy knew that his relationship with Williams that no manager could handle him. Even in the minor leagues, Ted Williams, I'm a hitter, and that's what I am, and I'm going to work on that, and you can work on the rest of it. So, in fact, he would dog it in the outfield in his early years because it just didn't matter to him. Hitting was all that mattered. So when McCarthy became the manager of the Red Sox, he knew that relationship was just as important as it was with Tony Lazzeri and just as important as it was with Grover Cleveland Alexander. So early in spring training, the story went that Williams hit a towering home run. And as he was going into his trot towards first base, and the dugout was near the first base side, McCarthy said loud enough so Williams could hear it to the rest of the team. He said, if I could have hit like that, I'd have played for nothing. and Williams liked that. So he got off to a good start with Williams, and then it stayed that way, such that when it came time for McCarthy's last game, and Williams came, he said to Williams at that time, he said, Ted, there's a lot of those people out there that said we were going to quarrel. And over the last 2 years, we never did. And Williams said that was one of the nicest things that anybody ever said to him. Just a recognition of their relationship and its professional nature. So McCarthy had a good way, and as Lou Gehrig pointed out, that great student of psychology, Joe McCarthy, best manager in baseball today. So that's why you have to pay attention to these 10 rules for success.
And it's a very interesting story. It's something that I think every baseball player, every baseball fan should understand because, in looking at McCarthy, the later 30s team, which you mentioned, was a juggernaut. 36, 37, 38, and 39. You couldn't stop the Yankees. And although they won, they would do it another decade later under Stengel. And they say, those Yankees teams were the greatest teams. No, they weren't the greatest teams at the time. If you go if you go through 49 and 50, 51, 52, and 53, the Yankees were predicted not to win the World Series because Casey had a lot of problems. You had an ailing DiMaggio in 49, and then in 50, you had some of the guys are retiring, and you got these newcomers like Hank Bauer, and they got what's his name, Johnny Sain, Johnny Sain, he was able to platoon Casey. But those teams, those Yankee teams, were nothing compared to the 36 through 39 juggernaut. We'll get into that. We'll get into that next time when you come back to the show, because we're going to have to come back because there's just so much to talk about. I had such a good time talking with you. You know,
well, one of these times we'll get into the actual commandments.
I'm telling you, people, my listeners know, and I had an author on the other day. And he said, I didn't think you were going to go an hour. I said, see, you got to come back again, because we didn't even scratch the surface. He's like, you do a lot of these interviewers don't do. You make us think outside the box. And it's just important to think outside the box, because it gets a general idea what you're thinking, and in your case, 170 pages, what you're thinking when you wrote the book. And that's what I want to get at. I mean, I want to sell the book. I don't want to, tell the people word for word what's written in it. But if you get an author's mind and you see that the author cares, maybe they'll pick it up and they'll say, hey, this is worth picking up. But
this is. Let me just say, this is emblematic of the first commandment, which is nobody ever became a baseball player by walking after a ball.
That's right.
Number one, what do? You hustle. And we're hustling, and you're hustling, Ian, and I thank you for it.
Well, it's just one of those things that is very important to me, and the philosophy is important. And I have a good time with you, JD. It's lawyer to lawyer. And, for a profession that is as dry as anything else and as nuanced, especially if you're in labor or taxes like I am, now that Trump has screwed up the whole system, you're going to go back and relearn everything, because you don't know what the hell you're talking about and you get a year to do it. So, for some that wrote and that archaic and all the education we go through and all the, turmoil and, it's funny because when I got out of law school in 96, there were signs all over the place. You see, it was black and white, and you see like the image of a lawyer at the bar taking a drink and like, well, we know you can pass the bar, but can you pass this bar? And just like baseball took a toll on its players, whether for leisure or whether to, get rid of a hampering injury, and they used alcohol or whatever to just drown the pain. Lawyers, and people don't understand, lawyers are probably, besides brain surgeons and someone like that, are the most stressful profession you can pick. And, first for me was criminals, and then it was, ambulance chasing, and then it was contracts in businesses, and then it became even more scary when it became more of a niche for me for tax. When I got my master's in tax and accounting, now you're gambling with millions of dollars and people's life savings. And so what I do when I get off the phone for you, I got another person I got to save for retirement. The IRS is coming after him, but I've saved 4 of them already within the last 2 years. And, I don't make a lot off these people, but I'm just glad that I'm helping them, ease their comfort in retirement, that the IRS, and to get the IRS off back. And it's stressful because you got to, they're just like labor. They're not negotiating. They're standing still, and they have to go to the next level. I hate appeals. And I think baseball, there's something to McCarthy's philosophy, which applies to our profession. So hold the line. We'll talk to you right after I end the show, and then we'll set a date for the next time. And, hey, it's been great, folks. As you see, 10 Commandments of Baseball, Joe McCarthy. We're going to bring JD back. I'm having such a good time. This thing could go on forever. Go out. It's Valentine's Day. Get your loved one copy of this book. It's not long. It's a light read. It's an interesting read. Go out, learn about the Ten Commandments of baseball. As always, I'm your host, Ian Kahanowitz, in for the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. We are happy to have J.D. Thorne on the show again. And as I always leave you, in the immortal words, again, immortal words of one of my heroes, Edward R. Murrow. Good night, folks, and good luck.